Kia ora, All Saints whānau, and welcome to another House Church Sunday. Woohoo! Did any of you feel the earthquake the other night? It was really interesting seeing different people's reactions to it. Andy and I grew up in Christchurch and went through the earthquakes there, and it's funny, we've found that it seems like half the people who were in Christchurch over those big earthquakes are terrified of earthquakes, understandably, and avoid them at all costs, and then the other half really don't care. And thankfully Andy and I didn't have particularly traumatic experiences, and so we just sort of brush it off. In fact, it's almost a novelty trying to guess the magnitude, and I remember this one time in Christchurch I guessed the magnitude and depth exactly correctly of one of the aftershocks. I was very proud of myself. It was a bit of an ongoing game and there were a lot of them, so I suppose the chances were pretty high. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit of a story about what Christchurch was like post-earthquake, so in the days immediately following, or weeks immediately following. And basically what happened was people were encouraged to check on their neighbours, particularly to find if there were any elderly people in their street or in their neighbourhood who maybe didn't have support or couldn't be contacted via social media, things like that. And so people who had never met their neighbours started door knocking, and people who had loosely known their neighbours started catching up in the street. And then also when you were walking down the street, if you passed by any strangers, people would immediately smile and say hello. And it was such a different experience, I think, because everyone had this shared experience of what had happened, although it was different for each of us. And there was this sense that there was something deeper going on. There was this deeper connection between each of us. But it's interesting, some of the people who were celebrated coming out of that. So there was Sam Johnson, who headed up the Student Volunteer Army, which was an incredible effort, really. Managed to get a whole lot of students to go across town and do things like shoveling the silt or the liquefaction out of people's backyards twice after each of the earthquakes, sometimes returning to the same house twice, but people still got up and did it. And so Sam led that group really well. And then there was the Mayor, Bob Parker, who got really praised for his efforts over that time as well. And it's interesting because although they were the ones that got all the acclamation, there was actually something much deeper that happened across the whole city. Everyone really changed because the atmosphere changed. Now, we're starting a series on Acts. This is the first week of it this week. And in the book of Acts, sometimes it's called the Acts of the Apostles. But really, it's more like the Acts of Jesus and the Spirit. The apostles might be the ones who seem to be going out and doing all these miraculous things, but actually, it's really a follow-on from Luke's Gospel. This is part 2, his second book, as Luke writes the book of Acts, where he talks about what Jesus continues. In fact, at the start of the book of Acts, he says that in his former book, Luke, he talks about what Jesus began to do, which implies that this book is what Jesus continues to do. And so as we go through this book, one of the most important things for us to remember is it's not just about these 12 or 11 at this point, people who did these amazing things and they were these incredible apostles and good for them. It's really about this move of God, this move of the Spirit, and this work that Jesus began that continues all the way to this day. Now, Luke, who wrote Acts, was a doctor and a Gentile, and he was a travelling co-worker with Paul. And this book, or both of the books, Luke and Acts, were thought to have been written about 61 to 63 AD while Paul was in prison. And there's this incredible transformation that gets described throughout all of the Gospels really, but of what happened to the disciples before the resurrection and after. And I've talked about this in a previous sermon, but I find it so fascinating that after Jesus died, but before he was resurrected, the disciples were terrified. They were in a locked room. They were basically hiding for fear of their lives. Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. One of Jesus's closest followers had said that he didn't even know him at one of the most crucial times. But then, post-resurrection, the disciples all of a sudden got to the point where they were all, bar one, martyred for their faith, and they stood up for it, and they travelled, and they spread the message. And Peter, who had just a few weeks earlier denied Jesus altogether, suddenly gives this big speech on Pentecost about what the move of God is doing. They had witnessed something absolutely incredible that drastically changed their lives, and it then changed the atmosphere of everything from then on. With Jesus' kingdom, the disciples before the resurrection still had this view that Jesus was going to become king in the fashion that they were used to. They knew he was different, but they knew that because Jesus chose 12 disciples, that was representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And so there was this sense that, yes, Jesus as the true king is going to restore Israel. And what that meant to them was that Jesus would become king, there would be Jesus' government in place, and Israel would be lifted up to this amazing place, and the rest of the nations would be judged for their wickedness. And so they asked Jesus if they could have positions of power within his government before he died. And then he did die. And all of a sudden, everything that they thought was changed. They thought that they had this big hope of what was to happen, and all of their hopes were dashed. And I think they probably had a similar view to what happened with David. So David, before he was king, in the Old Testament, he was in hiding from Saul, and so he drew together a whole bunch of people who were disenfranchised with life. He drew together this motley crew, and they sort of stayed in hiding in this cave. And then eventually they came out of hiding, and then David became this amazing king that was said to have had a real heart for God. And so then he continued in his kingly reign. So I think they had a similar view to that of what was going to happen. And so then even more confusion when Jesus dies. But more understanding came with his appearance after resurrection. And there's a bit of confusion around the fact that Jesus was able to walk through walls and appear places suddenly. And so they thought maybe he was a ghost, which is sort of in some senses saying maybe he's not quite human. But what he showed was that actually, no, I am more than human. He showed them the scars that he had. He ate food to show that, ghosts can't eat food. Look at me, I am a human, but I'm more than a human, actually. He was a picture of heaven and earth combining. And so the story of Acts follows a pattern of spreading this news of heaven and earth combining. And it spreads this news of Jesus conquering death, which sealed his position as king. And it talks about spreading it in a particular pattern. First to Jerusalem, so the restoration of Israel in some senses, but then to the surrounding countryside of Judea and the hated neighbours in Samaria, and then the rest of the earth. Now the key thing here is that this is good news for everyone, not just Israel. And around this time, whenever there was a new king announced, there used to be these heralds that would be sent to all the different ends of the empire, and they would be sent out to explain that there is a new king has been announced, and that this was good news. And even if people weren't so keen on the king or the king's predecessors or the heirs that were following or anything like that, there was still this sense that actually having a king was better than anarchy. And so anytime a king was announced, they would all rejoice and go, okay, well, great, good, at least we have a king. That's very good. And in some senses, the apostles are acting a bit like this. They get sent out as heralds to the new king, that Jesus, through his death and resurrection, has secured his place as king. The kingdom has arrived. Now, not everybody recognizes Jesus as the king. We know that the kingdom is not yet fully here, but it has arrived, at least in part. And so as these heralds to the new king, these apostles are heralds or witnesses, and they are sent out, but they are also sent out with the power of the Spirit. And that's where we come back to the concept of the book of Acts being not just the Acts of the Apostles, but of Jesus and of the Spirit. There's a sense that even though Jesus is ascended to heaven, although not just the soul of him that's ascended to heaven, which is what used to be the concept that they thought of for kings. They used to think that the soul of the king was ascended to heaven, which therefore makes him a god, basically, and therefore his heir can be called the Son of God, which is quite a nice title if you're trying to rule a land, to be able to be called the Son of God. But instead his whole body gets taken up, the symbol that actually what heaven and earth are is bigger than just this floating place in the sky and then this physical place down here, but there's a sense of togetherness of both of them. And so they get sent out with the power of the Spirit, these apostles. And as with the early disciples, we are sent. Thousands of years after these events, we continue to be sent. Some of us are sent to our own people, some of us to our neighbours, some of us to our enemies, and some of us to the ends of the earth, but we are all sent. We all take the power of the Spirit of God with us to continue the work of our King Jesus and to bring together heaven and earth. And so I have some questions for you. What stands out to you so far as we begin to talk about the book of Acts? Have you thought of yourself as sent before? Where or to whom do you think God is sending you? And what does it look like to have the power of the Spirit of God with you? And may that powerful Spirit be with you now as you discuss in your house churches. God bless.